right forearm, superficial abrasion, 3 centimeters.
Date and time of injury confirmed as 0800 hours.
All right, let's move on to the intake form.
Late winter, 1945. A requisition school building near the front line has been turned into a temporary infirmary. Its windows are fogged from breath and boiled water. The air smells of damp wool, antiseptic, and smoke carried in from somewhere beyond the trees. Inside, a row of women sit silently on wooden benches. Their coats are thin. Their hands are swollen, cracked skin, infected cuts, frost damage earned through months of labor and exposure. They are prisoners. Some have not spoken in days. Across the room, U.S. Army nurses move with practiced calm. Olive drab uniforms. Red Cross armbands. No raised voices. No hurried gestures. One nurse kneels, takes a woman's hand, and begins to clean it carefully. Warm water first, then gauze, then a slow, deliberate wrap. The prisoner stiffens, not from pain, but from disbelief. This is not how guards have touched them before. There is no shouting, no force, no punishment, only steady hands doing what they were trained to do. For a brief moment, the war seems to pause, not outside the building, but within it. And to understand why this quiet act carried such weight, the story must move backward into the conditions that brought these women here in the first place. By the time American nurses encountered female prisoners in the closing phases of the Second World War, the conflict had already stripped Europe and large parts of Asia down to exhaustion. The war had entered its most destructive phase not through sudden offensives, but through collapse of supply lines, of medical systems, and of civilian protection. From 1943 onward, women increasingly found themselves pulled directly into the machinery of war. In Nazi-occupied Europe, they served as factory laborers, agricultural workers, clerks, auxiliaries, and forced laborers. In the collapsing Third Reich, teenage girls and older women were pressed into anti-aircraft units, communications roles, and logistical support. In the Pacific, women were interned as civilians, nurses, or auxiliaries under Japanese control, often enduring starvation and disease. Across theaters, female captivity was no longer an exception. It had become routine. By late 1944 and early 1945, Allied advances exposed the full scale of detention systems. Prisoners were discovered not only in formal camps, but in transit compounds, labor detachments, abandoned rail depots, and improvised holding centers hastily assembled as German and Japanese forces retreated. Many prisoners have been moved repeatedly. Each relocation meant fewer rations, less shelter, and no medical care. Hands told much of that story. Women assigned to manual labor, clearing rubble after air raids, digging trenches, repairing roads, unloading supplies, worked without gloves in freezing or wet conditions. Skin split. Infections followed. Burns from chemicals and fuel went untreated. Frostbite was common during the winter of 1944-45, one of the coldest in decades across Europe. In camps and work details, medical attention was rare and often withheld as punishment. When Allied forces advanced, they encountered prisoners in states of extreme neglect. Medical officers documented malnutrition, trench foot, gangrene, and untreated fractures. Female prisoners frequently suffered in silence, conditioned by months or years of being ignored or punished for requesting help. By doctrine, prisoners were to be evacuated, registered, and treated. In practice, frontline chaos meant care arrived unevenly and often late. At the same time, the United States military medical system had reached a level of organization unmatched by any force in the war. By 1945, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had expanded from fewer than 1,000 nurses before the war to more than 59,000 serving worldwide. They operated in evacuation hospitals, field hospitals, hospital trains, and makeshift aid stations set up wherever combat paused long enough to allow treatment. These nurses were not improvising compassion. They were executing doctrine. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, medical personnel were required to treat wounded and sick prisoners of war without discrimination. Training manuals emphasized neutrality, restraint, and adherence to procedure, even under emotional strain. For nurses, This meant applying the same standards of hygiene, pain management, and wound care to enemy prisoners as to Allied soldiers. Yet doctrine alone did not explain the reaction of the women sitting in those infirmaries. Most prisoners had never experienced neutral medical care. Their interactions with authority had been transactional or violent. Touch had meant inspection, punishment, or forced labor. Even basic sanitation, clean water, sterile bandages, gentle handling, had disappeared from daily life long before liberation. So when American nurses began treating female prisoners, the contrast was immediate and disorienting. The nurses did not rush. They did not interrogate. They did not display hostility. They followed steps learned in stateside hospitals and reinforced in combat zones, cleaning wounds thoroughly, monitoring signs of shock, rewrapping bandages when they loosened, and speaking calmly even when language barriers prevented understanding. For many prisoners, the act of having their hands treated carefully carried a meaning far beyond medicine. Hands had been tools of survival, worked raw, punished when weak, ignored when injured. To have them cleaned and wrapped with patience signaled something unfamiliar: recognition. And as the war ground closer to its end, these small moments of care began to accumulate inside temporary hospitals and holding facilities, quietly reshaping how prisoners understood not just their captors, but the war itself. That realization would deepen as medical encounters multiplied, revealing the structure, discipline, and moral boundaries guiding the nurses who delivered them. The presence of U.S. Army nurses in prisoner treatment facilities during the final year of the war was not accidental. It was the result of a medical system designed to move forward with the armies, absorb chaos, and impose order where none existed. By 1944, American field medicine had become both highly mobile and methodically standardized, allowing care to be delivered under conditions that would have crippled earlier armies. Army nurses were deployed wherever casualties accumulated, often within miles of active fighting. Evacuation hospitals followed advancing units, while clearing stations and aid posts were set up in captured buildings, tents, and abandoned infrastructure. When prisoners were taken in large numbers, especially during rapid collapses of German formations in France, Belgium, and later Germany itself, medical units were tasked with triage and stabilization before transport. Female prisoners presented a specific challenge. Many were civilians or auxiliaries rather than uniformed combatants. Records were incomplete. Language barriers were severe. And unlike male prisoners, many had suffered prolonged physical deterioration without any form of medical oversight. U.S. medical officers noted that women frequently arrived in worse condition than expected, not because their injuries were more severe, but because they had been ignored longer. Within this system, nurses occupied a critical role. Physicians set priorities and diagnosed conditions, but nurses executed care hour by hour. They cleaned wounds. They monitored fevers. They dressed frostbite. They watched for signs of infection spreading beneath damaged skin. These tasks required close physical contact and time, resources in short supply during active operations. Training shaped how that contact occurred. Army Nurse Corps training emphasized discipline, emotional control, and consistency. Nurses were taught to avoid displays of anger, pity, or revulsion, not because those feelings were absent, but because visible emotion could compromise care. Patients, especially prisoners, were to be treated as bodies in need of stabilization, not as symbols of the enemy. This professional restraint often came across as gentleness. In contrast to guards or military police, nurses approached prisoners without weapons. Their hands are usually bare or gloved for sanitation, not control. They spoke in measured tones, even when not understood. Instructions were demonstrated physically: how to hold a hand steady, how to relax fingers, how to allow a bandage to be wrapped without resistance. For women who had spent months anticipating pain from authority, the absence of aggression created a psychological shock. Some recoiled when nurses first touched their hands. Others froze, expecting punishment for flinching or weakness. Nurses documented this behavior in letters and reports, noting how prisoners would watch their faces closely, searching for signs of hostility that never appeared. The act of bandaging hands became especially symbolic. Hands were both vulnerable and personal. Treating them required patience and precision. Cleaning between fingers, trimming damaged skin, applying ointment evenly, and wrapping gauze so circulation was not cut off. It was not a procedure that could be rushed without risking further injury. In multiple facilities, nurses repeated the same routines regardless of nationality or status. German women, Eastern European forced laborers, civilian detainees, each received the same standardized care. The repetition itself carried meaning. It signaled predictability in a world that had become violently unpredictable. Military regulations reinforced this behavior. Any deviation, rough handling, neglect, or discriminatory treatment could be investigated. But more often, discipline was internal. Nurses understood that how they treated prisoners reflected not only on themselves, but on the institution they represented. As Allied forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, these encounters multiplied. Temporary infirmaries filled with women whose bodies bore the cumulative damage of war. And with each careful dressing and re-wrapped hand, a subtle line was drawn between conquest and control, between vengeance and restraint. That line would be tested as the war reached its decisive moments, when the pressure on medical units intensified and the true weight of these quiet acts became impossible to ignore. By the time they reached Allied medical care, many female prisoners were operating at the edge of physical collapse. Medical reports described bodies depleted by months of insufficient calories, repetitive labor, and exposure. Weight loss was severe. Muscle tone had faded. Skin injuries, especially on hands, were common and often advanced beyond simple cuts. Hands are constantly in use. Women cleared debris after bombings, loaded supplies, scrubbed facilities, and worked fields in all weather. Gloves were rare or forbidden. Cuts became infected. Frostbite hardened fingertips. Burns from fuel, lye, or industrial chemicals went untreated. In some cases, women hid injuries, knowing that visible weakness could lead to reassignment to harsher work or punishment. When these prisoners encountered nurses, their initial reactions were shaped by this history. Many presented their hands hesitantly, palms half closed, bracing for pain. Some apologized reflexively, conditioned to justify their own injuries. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The physical damage was visible, the psychological damage less so. Hands had become instruments of survival, stripped of dignity and autonomy. To have them examined carefully, cleaned rather than inspected, challenged what captivity had taught them about authority. This contrast would define how the women remembered the encounter long after the war ended. From a military perspective, treating prisoners was not an act of sentiment. It was a requirement. Wounded or ill prisoners slowed operations, strained transport, and risked spreading disease through camps and evacuation routes. Effective medical care stabilized populations and reduced long-term logistical burden. Nurses understood this reality. Their work served operational efficiency as much as humanitarian obligation. By preventing infections, restoring basic function, and identifying cases requiring evacuation, they reduced mortality and secondary complications. Hands, in particular, needed immediate attention. Untreated infections could spread rapidly, requiring amputation or prolonged hospitalization. Yet tactical necessity did not negate humane execution. On the contrary, standardized care demanded consistency. Bandages were applied correctly regardless of patient identity. Ointments were measured. Circulation was checked. Pain responses were monitored and adjusted for. This precision mattered. Poorly wrapped hands could swell, restricting blood flow and worsening injury. Nurses took time to ensure proper technique, even when queues were long and pressure constant. The methodical pace was deliberate. To prisoners, this patience appeared extraordinary. But within the military system, it was professionalism in its purest form, doing the job correctly under constraint. War erodes moral clarity by design. Lines blur. Violence becomes routine. But medical care operates within a defined boundary, one enforced by training, law, and tradition. For nurses, this boundary was non-negotiable. They did not decide who deserved treatment. That decision had been made long before, embedded in conventions and reinforced by command. Once a wounded body appeared before them, it became their responsibility. Nationality, ideology, and uniform ceased to matter. This clarity protected both patient and provider. Nurses could act without hesitation because their role was narrowly defined. They were not arbiters of justice. They were caretakers of injury. Female prisoners sensed this distinction immediately. The absence of interrogation or judgment created a different emotional space. Care was given without explanation or demand. Hands were bandaged because they were injured, not because the patient had earned it. In a war defined by conditional mercy, this unconditional act carried weight. The most frequently reported reaction among female prisoners was not gratitude, but confusion. Gentleness contradicted everything captivity had taught them. It did not fit the narrative of enemies or victors. Some women cried quietly as their hands were treated. Others stared at the bandages afterward, turning their fingers slowly as if testing whether the moment was real. Nurses noticed this behavior and documented it without commentary, aware that something beyond medicine was taking place. The shock lay not in the bandage itself, but in how it was applied, slowly, carefully, without coercion. This restraint forced prisoners to confront the possibility that the war was not universally cruel. That realization would deepen as treatment continued, and as the broader implications of these encounters came into focus. What appeared to prisoners as spontaneous kindness was, in reality, the product of rigid institutional discipline. U.S. Army nurses operated under strict codes governing conduct, hygiene, and interaction with all patients, including prisoners of war. These codes existed to ensure consistency under pressure, but they also limited the intrusion of personal bias into medical care. Nurses were instructed to maintain emotional control. Displays of anger, pity, or moral judgment were discouraged, not out of indifference, but because such emotions could alter treatment decisions. In crowded infirmaries where exhaustion and stress were constant, discipline protected patients from variability. This structure mattered. It meant that the care a woman received did not depend on the nurse's mood, background, or wartime experience. Procedures were followed step by step. Wounds were cleaned thoroughly. Bandages were changed on schedule. Pain responses were monitored and adjusted. For prisoners accustomed to arbitrary treatment, this predictability was unfamiliar. The absence of caprice created a sense of safety that had been missing for months or years. Care was not a favor. It was an obligation carried out with precision. In this way, compassion was embedded into the system itself. For many female prisoners, their understanding of the enemy had been shaped entirely by propaganda and direct abuse. Allied forces were described as brutal, vindictive, and indifferent to suffering. Medical encounters disrupted this narrative in ways words could not. The nurses did not argue against propaganda. They did not offer explanations. They simply worked. Hands were washed. Gauze was folded. Bandages were secured. The routine spoke louder than any declaration. It forced prisoners to reconcile two incompatible images, the enemy as threat and the enemy as caretaker. This reframing did not erase trauma. It did not absolve the war, but it introduced complexity. Some prisoners later recalled that these medical encounters were the first moments they understood the war might end without their annihilation. That realization altered behavior within camps and holding areas. Resistance softened. Panic diminished. Compliance increased, not out of submission, but out of trust that injury would no longer be ignored. Female prisoners occupied a distinct position within wartime captivity. They were expected to endure the same labor as men, yet often received even less medical attention. Injuries were minimized. Pain was dismissed. Vulnerability was treated as weakness. When nurses, many of them women themselves, treated female prisoners, the encounter carried an additional layer of meaning. There was an unspoken recognition of bodily fragility and shared physical reality. Hands were handled with an awareness of how easily damage could become permanent. This was not sentimentality. It was anatomical understanding shaped by training and experience. Nurses recognized how malnutrition, exposure, and repetitive labor affected women differently and adjusted care accordingly. For prisoners, this attentiveness felt unprecedented. It restored a sense of bodily legitimacy, an acknowledgement that their pain was real and worthy of response. Years after the war, when female prisoners were asked what they remembered most clearly, many did not speak first of liberation or victory. They spoke of hands. They remembered warm water, clean cloth, the careful pressure of gauze, the way a nurse adjusted a wrap to ease circulation. These details endured because they marked a rupture in experience, a moment when the logic of cruelty failed. Nurses, too, remembered these encounters. In letters and oral histories, they described treating prisoners as one of the quiet confirmations that their work mattered beyond survival statistics. They rarely framed it as heroism. It was simply the job done correctly. Together, these memories formed a record not of triumph, but of restraint, an understated counterpoint to the violence that defined the war. And as Allied advances reached their climax, the cumulative effect of such moments would be tested under the most intense pressure of the conflict. The decisive test of these medical principles came not during moments of calm, but during collapse. In early 1945, as Allied forces crossed into Germany and Japanese positions unraveled across the Pacific, prisoner intake surged beyond anything medical units had previously experienced. Entire labor detachments dissolved overnight. Holding facilities filled faster than they could be cataloged. Evacuation hospitals became choke points. Trains arrived without manifests. Trucks unloaded prisoners whose injuries had never been recorded. Many women arrived with hands wrapped in improvised rags, if they were wrapped at all. Some had infections so advanced that the skin had hardened or split open again with movement. Under these conditions, speed threatened to replace care. Command pressure was constant. Clear the backlog. Stabilize quickly. Move prisoners onward. In theory, this environment encouraged shortcuts. In practice, it revealed which systems would hold under strain. Nurses adapted without abandoning procedure. Triage was ruthless but precise. Hands with active infection were treated immediately. Frostbite cases were prioritized before tissue loss became irreversible. Bandaging stations were reorganized to maximize efficiency without reducing contact time. This reorganization mattered. It preserved the defining element of these encounters, deliberate care. In one documented facility in Central Europe, nurses treated hundreds of female prisoners over the course of several days as German forces withdrew and Allied lines surged forward. The environment was chaotic, artillery in the distance, shortages of clean bedding, power interruptions, but wound care continued uninterrupted. Water was heated manually. Gauze was rationed and reused only when regulations allowed. Hands were still cleaned properly. For the prisoners, the scale of treatment was overwhelming. Many had assumed that medical attention would stop once numbers became too large. Instead, the opposite occurred. Care became more structured, not less. The system absorbed them. This moment marked a turning point in perception. The women began to understand that this was not an exception or a temporary performance. It was policy executed under fire. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Prisoners stopped hiding injuries. They presented their hands openly. Some removed makeshift wrappings before being asked, trusting that proper care would follow. Compliance replaced fear. Nurses noticed this change immediately. Work became more efficient as resistance dropped. Patients allowed themselves to be examined fully. The emotional distance between caregiver and prisoner narrowed, not into familiarity, but into functional trust. At the same time, the ethical stakes increased. The war's violence was at its peak. Cities burned. Casualty lists expanded daily. Nurses were treating enemy prisoners while Allied soldiers arrived with catastrophic wounds. The temptation to triage emotionally, to prioritize one group over another, was real. But the system held. Prisoners were treated according to injury severity, not allegiance. Hands infected with gangrene received the same urgency regardless of uniform or language. This adherence was not celebrated. It was enforced quietly, moment by moment, bandage by bandage. The climax of this story was not a single dramatic event, but the sustained application of restraint at scale. It was the moment when the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Yet vengeance did not replace professionalism. And as the front lines pushed forward, this disciplined compassion followed, into newly liberated camps, into makeshift hospitals, and into the final weeks of the conflict, where its impact would deepen further. As the war moved into its final months, the medical encounters between U.S. nurses and female prisoners took on a different weight. Victory was no longer theoretical. German resistance was collapsing across the Reich, and Japanese forces, though still fighting fiercely, were increasingly isolated. The question was no longer whether the war would end, but how its end would be carried. In newly liberated areas, nurses entered spaces that revealed the cumulative cost of neglect. Former labor camps, transit depots, and detention centers contained women whose hands bore layered injuries. Old fractures never set, scars reopened by repeated work, and infections masked by scar tissue. These were not battlefield wounds. They were the injuries of prolonged exposure and indifference. Treating such damage required time and emotional discipline. Some injuries could not be reversed. Circulation loss had become permanent. Fingers were stiffened beyond recovery. Nurses documented these limits without dramatization, recording what could and could not be done. Yet even when full recovery was impossible, care continued. Hands were cleaned even when function could not be restored. Bandages were applied even when healing would be partial. Pain was managed when cure was no longer available. This insistence carried meaning. It communicated that worth was not contingent on outcome. For many prisoners, this realization marked a psychological crossing. The war had taught them that attention followed utility. Once injured, they had been discarded. Now, attention followed need alone. In one Allied hospital report from the spring of 1945, nurses noted how women began to assist one another after treatment, adjusting each other's bandages, reminding one another to keep hands clean, sharing instructions through gestures and broken language. Care had become communal, extending beyond the nurse's reach. This shift mattered. It suggested that the medical encounter was no longer isolated. Its principles were being internalized. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, prisoner facilities transitioned into repatriation and recovery centers. The volume of patients remained high, but the nature of care evolved. Emergency triage gave way to rehabilitation. Nurses spent more time on dressing changes, infection monitoring, and long-term wound management. For the women whose hands had been treated in the war's final weeks, these continued interactions reinforced the initial shock of gentleness. What had seemed extraordinary became routine. Routine became expectation. The turning point, then, was complete. Not because the war had ended, but because the logic governing these encounters had proven durable. Compassion had not faltered under victory. Discipline had not dissolved into neglect. The system had carried its values to the end. For nurses, this consistency offered a quiet validation. They had not merely survived the war. They had practiced their profession intact. For prisoners, it reframed the war's conclusion. Liberation was not defined only by flags or announcements, but by the sustained presence of care where cruelty had once been absolute. As the fighting stopped, the consequences of this reframing began to surface, shaping memory, testimony, and a long aftermath of captivity. When the war formally ended, the work of military medicine did not slow. In many ways, it intensified. The immediate aftermath of victory revealed the depth of physical damage that had been temporarily stabilized but not resolved during combat operations. 4 female prisoners, This period marked the transition from survival to reckoning. Medical teams conducted systematic examinations as part of repatriation and demobilization. Records compiled in late 1945 documented the long-term effects of untreated injuries, particularly to hands. Chronic infections, nerve damage, reduced mobility, and permanent scarring were widespread. These conditions affected not only physical ability, but the capacity to resume civilian life. U.S. nurses continued to play a central role during this phase. Their tasks shifted from emergency intervention to maintenance and monitoring. Bandages were changed regularly. Infections were tracked. Patients were taught basic wound care to continue after discharge. These interactions were less dramatic, but no less significant. For many women, the continuation of careful treatment confirmed that the earlier encounters had not been performative. Care had not been withdrawn once hostilities ceased. The same standards applied. The same routines held. Psychologically, this consistency mattered deeply. Trauma specialists would later note that predictable, non-threatening care helped stabilize prisoners suffering from prolonged stress and fear. While nurses were not trained therapists, their disciplined behavior created an environment where recovery could begin. Former prisoners frequently described these post-war medical spaces as the first places where time slowed. There were schedules. There was order. Injuries were addressed methodically rather than ignored. Hands, once instruments of forced labor, were now treated as parts of a body deserving protection. The broader consequences extended beyond individual recovery. Reports from Allied medical units influenced post-war assessments of detention conditions and humanitarian law compliance. Documentation of injuries supported investigations into forced labor systems and camp administration. The state of prisoners' hands, damaged through labor and neglect, became evidence. Nurses' notes, written without commentary or judgment, contributed to this record. They described conditions precisely: swelling, discoloration, infection stages, tissue loss. These clinical observations later informed historical understanding of civilian and auxiliary suffering during the war. At the same time, nurses themselves were processing their experiences. Many returned home carrying vivid memories of these encounters. In letters and memoirs, they often mentioned prisoners not as enemies, but as patients whose injuries demanded attention regardless of origin. This reframing shaped how nurses understood their own service. They had not merely supported victory. They had upheld a standard. As repatriation progressed and facilities emptied, the immediate phase of aftermath gave way to longer-term consequences, how these experiences would be remembered, interpreted, and integrated in a post-war life. In the years that followed the war, the medical encounters between U.S. nurses and female prisoners faded from official narratives, overshadowed by battles, treaties, and political reconstruction. Yet for the women who experienced them, these moments remained fixed with unusual clarity. Survivor testimonies collected in the late 1940s and 1950s often referenced medical care as a psychological boundary, dividing captivity from survival. While liberation was a process rather than a single event, many women marked the beginning of their return to selfhood with the first time they were treated without fear. Hands were frequently mentioned. They had carried the burden of work and punishment. Their care symbolized a reversal of role, from expendable labor to human patient. For some, the impact was immediate. Trust in medical authority allowed continued treatment after repatriation. Others required years before seeking help again, but when they did, they often compared civilian care to that first experience of restraint and precision. The memory became a benchmark. Historians examining post-war humanitarian practices have noted how Allied medical conduct influenced evolving standards. The consistent treatment of prisoners reinforced interpretations of the Geneva Conventions and informed later training for military medical personnel. The war had tested these principles at scale, and they had held. Within the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, the experience shaped professional identity. Nurses returned home with a reinforced understanding of neutrality as strength. Many remained in medicine, carrying forward lessons learned under extreme conditions. In professional journals and reunions, they spoke of prisoners rarely and without dramatization, framing the work as obligation fulfilled rather than moral triumph. The absence of self-congratulation is telling. These encounters were not remembered as exceptional. They were remembered as correct. For former prisoners, this distinction mattered. It suggested that dignity need not depend on gratitude. Care had been given because it was required, not because it was earned. Over time, these memories integrated into broader narratives of the war's end. They complicated simple divisions between victor and vanquished. They introduced evidence of restraint within destruction, and they highlighted the role of individuals operating within systems designed to prevent cruelty from becoming absolute. The long aftermath of captivity involved rebuilding lives, addressing disabilities, and processing trauma. The careful bandaging of hands did not erase what came before or after, but it offered a moment of interruption, a proof that war did not fully extinguish professional ethics. As decades passed, these quiet acts remained largely invisible in popular histories, yet they endured where it mattered most, in the lived memory of those whose bodies bore the marks of war and whose recovery began with a gesture of disciplined care. That endurance brings the story to its final reflection. What this episode reveals about warfare, medicine, and the fragile persistence of humanity under extreme strain. The Second World War is often remembered through its extremes: mass violence, ideological fanaticism, and industrial-scale death. Within that landscape, quiet acts of care can seem insignificant. Yet history is shaped as much by what endures as by what explodes. When U.S. nurses bandaged the hands of female prisoners, they were not making statements. They were fulfilling a role defined by training, law, and professional identity. That distinction matters. The power of the act lay precisely in its ordinariness. It was not mercy bestowed from above, but obligation carried out without deviation. Hands tell stories that weapons cannot. They reveal labor, neglect, and survival. In caring for them carefully, nurses addressed not only physical injury, but a deeper erosion of trust. They demonstrated that even in total war, systems could enforce restraint, and individuals could uphold it under pressure. This does not redeem the war. It does not balance suffering with kindness, but it complicates the narrative. It shows that violence was not the only force at work. Alongside destruction operated professions bound by ethics strong enough to survive chaos. For the women whose hands were treated, the experience did not erase captivity, but it marked a boundary. Before, injury meant abandonment. After, injury meant attention. That shift altered how the war ended for them, not in triumph, but in recognition. For the nurses, the moment confirmed something quieter, that doing the job correctly, even when no one was watching, mattered. That discipline could be a form of humanity, and that the values taught in classrooms and manuals were not theoretical. They were operational. In the aftermath of war, nations rebuilt cities and redrew borders. Less visibly, they rebuilt trust in institutions capable of restraint. The careful bandaging of a prisoner's hands was a small part of that reconstruction, but a real one. It reminds us that history is not only made by decisions at the top or violence at the front. Sometimes it is shaped by steady hands, working carefully when cruelty would have been easier.